Okay, while we're waiting for everyone else, let's get started. Where has the time gone? Last class. I feel like we just got started. Okay, so we're going to do a couple things today. We are going to have a shorter lecture today, lecture 30. I originally had two topics down for there, and I thought we'd just focus on one final topic. An actual 3D printing of an actual robot that walks out of the printer. This has been a goal in evolutionary robotics for the last 18 years. Just was accomplished last year, so I think this is probably a good place to end the course. Depending on the timing, we got some other things to do first. We'll have some time for discussion. So I sent around a note on Blackboard yesterday, some sort of food for thought. Throughout this course, we've covered a lot of ground, seen a lot of robots, fitness functions, task environments. But most importantly, we've seen evidence that we can evolve X, where X is some building block of intelligence, right? We've seen a lot of building blocks of intelligence, but there are some things that we haven't talked about or touched on in this course, or that evolutionary robotics has not yet tackled or not figured out how to tackle. So I'd like you to think about what are some of the aspects of intelligence that are missing from the experiments we've talked about in this class. And we'll also have some time to talk about sort of how your thinking about robotics and AI might have changed over the course of the semester. So we'll leave that for the end of today and some time to chat informally. A little bit about the final project. As I mentioned, you are going to have a grand total of 2 minutes and 30 seconds to present your work orally, not a second longer. You're going to be submitting a 2-minute and 30-second long YouTube video to the TA at 11:59 on Wednesday, May the 9th. And then Rob will stitch all of those videos together. So if you don't get the video to him in time, it's not going to be in the playlist, and you will not be able to present your project orally on the 10th. So please make sure to get your video submitted to Rob. Okay, 2 minutes and 30 seconds goes very quickly. So what we're going to do is when you come to class on Thursday, I will write the schedule up here, all 64 presentations. If you're the first person, you will come down and you'll start your presentation when I click go on the playlist. And if you're second on the list, you'll come down a minute before. So this will be sort of our warm-up area here. So if you're next to present according to the schedule, make sure that you come down so you don't have to walk and talk once your video comes up. As promised, we're not going to press pause on the playlist because we've got a lot of presentations to get through in a short period of time. Sound good? Okay. Again, 2 minutes and 30 seconds is not a lot of time, so practice, practice, practice. Okay. Any other questions about the final project? No, we're all good. Like I said, I don't have any more official office hours between now and your presentation time, but if you're desperate and you need me or the TA, email us and we might be able to carve out a little bit of time for you. Okay. Some other things I want to talk about before we get to the last lecture is we are currently advertising for a job in the lab. This is a job to help us build what we're calling the world's first in-browser supercomputer. So I'll give you a little bit of the backstory for this project and this job opening, and then I'll talk about the job itself. So some of you may be aware that here at UVM, we have the Vermont Advanced Computing Core, or the VACC. This is UVM's supercomputer. We're now above, we have a little bit more than 4,000 machines that are available for researchers to use. And I thought if you haven't seen the VACC before, I'd show you how it works. So on my local machine here, I have just SSH'd into a computer called Blue Moon User 1. Blue Moon is our nickname for the VACC. VACC has 2 user nodes, so these are 2 computers that you can log into, and then these are staging posts for launching your computational jobs. So I've logged into user 1, which is over somewhere in Colchester with the other parts of the VACC. And if I type show queue here, this will show you the queue of all of the jobs that are currently running on the VACC. So you can see that there's a total of 3,700 processors currently available. There's always a few hundred that are down and being maintained and so on. So there's 3,700 processors that are available. 1,941 of them are currently being used. So we're using about 52% of the VACC at the current moment. And you can see a number of users here are running a number of jobs. So this particular user here has asked for just one machine, and they're running some computational job on that machine. They have 8 hours and 28 minutes left on that machine, and they started this job yesterday at noon. Okay, you can see there's another user here who's launched a number of different jobs, and each job requires 12 machines. So they must have some parallel code that's running and is being distributed across these 12 nodes, and they're doing multiple of those jobs. Someone here is running just a single job that requires 1,000 machines working in parallel. So this is the VACC on a normal day. And at the moment, I am serving as the director for the VACC, helping to make sure that new faculty and grad students are able to get their research up and running on the VACC. Today is a pretty good day. We're at 52%. Most days we're at 97 or 98% capacity. No matter how big your supercomputer is, there's always more computational demand than is available. So we've been trying to think about how can we move some of this work off of the VACC. One obvious option is to go to Amazon Cloud or go to other cloud services that are out there. Problem with that is that it tends to be expensive. Might be cheap for a relatively small job or a few jobs, but as you start to scale up the computational effort you want to throw at your problem, it starts to become more and more expensive. So is there a plan C? And this is something that we've been thinking about for a while. So I pitched an idea to the Sloan Foundation. The Sloan Foundation funds sort of citizen science projects. Does anybody here use the Jupyter notebooks? So the Sloan Foundation funded some researchers to develop the original Jupyter notebooks. So we recently, just 2 weeks ago, received a grant from the Sloan Foundation to develop an in-browser supercomputer. And the idea is to try and push some of the jobs, some of the computational jobs that UVM faculty or grad students might want to push to the VACC or push to the cloud, is to push them to computers here on campus. So as long as you have your browser open and you point it at the moment to this URL, this is just our prototype for the moment. If you point your browser to there, your browser or your machine will immediately perform this very complex calculation that you can see in the top left here. So we already have our in-browser supercomputer open. If you all had your devices with you today and all 40 of you opened your browsers and pointed to that, there would be 40 instances of this computation occurring, one on each of your computers, and then we would pull the results of those computations back to the server, to the Blue Moon server as part of the VACC. Okay, not very sophisticated at the moment, but we're hoping to build this up. How does this work? Well, at the moment, as a researcher, I might have some research code that I would like a bunch of machines to work on. Those of you that are doing evolution now in your final project, some of you are probably wishing for 2 or 3 more machines, or 200 or 300 more machines. So imagine you were to take your code and push it through a transpiler. Anybody know what a transpiler is? So a transpiler, as you might be able to work out from the word, takes as input code in one language and outputs the same program in another language. So we have a transpiler, we have 2 transpilers, one of them Emscripten, which takes in C code and outputs JavaScript. And there's another one, and I'm forgetting the name of it now, that takes as input Python and also outputs JavaScript. So the pipeline is we take your research code, transpile it into JavaScript, and it then gets mounted into this particular web page so that anyone that opens this web page runs your code in JavaScript. We get the results back. It goes back to the server. And since I'm currently sitting on the server here, I can then, as the researcher, collect my code back. So that's the idea for an in-browser supercomputer. So the more people we can convince to open their browsers and keep them pointed at a given URL, the more nodes we have at any one time available for researchers to run their code on.
How does that work if I then start running stuff on my computer that's computationally intensive? Do I need to remember to close the browser window?
Very good question. So we don't have an answer to that yet, and we're hoping to hire someone to help with that.
What about if you're sending something that's computationally difficult and they have a Mac computer and therefore don't have a good GPU?
Exactly, right. Then maybe they won't be able to run it or it will run very slowly. So part of my job as a researcher, if I want to push to this new supercomputer, is to break down my computation into bite-sized chunks. So think about your final project for the moment. You might want to run things for 200 generations. Maybe you run it for 2 generations, pickle your entire population, then unpickle it, run it for another 2 generations, pause, 2 generations, pause, 2 generations, pause. You're putting in sort of these breakpoints. That's one option.
You're definitely going to want that in case it closes the window.
And if somebody, what happens if somebody closes the computer partway through the computation? So again, we're now straying outside of my area of expertise. So we are looking to hire a developer to help with this project. And let me know if you're interested, and I can tell you more about this. It's a full-time position. We have funding for 3 years to work on this. So if you're interested, please let me know. Or if you have friends or colleagues who you think might be good for this position, let us know. Okay, it's a shameless plug for an open position in the lab. Okay, so back to evolutionary robotics and our final lecture, the 3D printing of 1D robots. Okay, the reading for today, as usual, is the actual research paper that introduces this idea. It was published just this last year. Some of the authors on that paper, you might recognize their name by now. Hod Lipson was one of the first inventors of 3D printers back at Cornell. Hod and I did some work a few years back on the Resilient Machines robot, the robot where we pulled off the leg and it kept moving. Hod and some of his colleagues got together and said, what is the best, given current 2017 technology, could we assemble a bunch of those technologies together to realize this dream of printing a robot and have the robot walk out of the printer? And this is the idea they came up with. So we're going to have a very simple robot. It's going to be a 1D robot, so it's basically just a long wire. And so this wire is going to be, it's going to be printed in the sense that we're going to have a roll of tape or have this wire ready to go. And this wire is going to be extruded through the printer, and we'll see the printer in a moment. And as it does, it bends the wire into arbitrary 3-dimensional shapes. So in this little cartoon here, in the yellow box, we have the printer itself. It's taking the raw material. It's folding the 1D robot into a 3D shape. The robot does its thing in the field. When we're done with the robot, we recycle the material back into the printer. So basically straighten the wire, feed it back into the feed head, and we can print another robot. So one of the challenges with 3D printing is they tend to be extremely wasteful. So could you print using recyclable material? And this is one way to do that. Nice thing about recycling the material is, as you can imagine, there's a simulator attached to the system, and they're going to evolve these robots and evolve the morphology for the robots to do something, so they can re-evolve a new robot to do something else and print a different robot using the same material, deploy it into a different environment, it does its thing, recycle the material, and so on. Yes?
Maybe it's too early, but I'm just wondering how big are these things? Because obviously the material you pick, like if you pick a tiny piece of wire, it's not going to scale up if you try to transfer to reality.
Absolutely. So a lot of these details are going to be sort of swept under the rug, and one question is, how much wire do you have at your disposal? I think these robots, the wire, when it's unwound, it's several meters long. So there's quite a bit of material.
Question that I would have is, if you deform the wire plastically, how's that going to change the material properties for the next run?
Absolutely. So there definitely is material fatigue. And for the engineers and material scientists in the room, they actually give a good description of the amount of fatigue, and other materials that they're now considering that have less wear and tear? Good question. You might be able to incorporate that into your fitness function, right? So are you bending material that's been used for other purposes? But again, an important thing to think about. Okay, so evolve in simulation, print or fold if you like, deploy into the world, recycle, re-evolve, reprint, refold, re-recycle, and so on indefinitely. At least, again, that's the idea in theory. They're going to show this simple process in practice, or a limited version of this in practice. Okay. So where did this idea come from? If you read the paper, they'll tell you that this concept was based on the idea of the ribosome. So like most evolutionary robotics we've seen so far, we're usually stealing ideas from nature. In this case, we're going to steal an idea from at the molecular level. Here's a little cartoon of what a ribosome does. A ribosome moves along messenger RNA, and messenger RNA contains information from DNA. So this is the blueprint, or as we talked about when we talked about Evo-Devo, it's the recipe about how to make something, right? That's what you're seeing here. The ribosome moves along messenger RNA, and as it does, it reads what's there, goes and finds the appropriate amino acid, which are the little colored beads that you see here, grabs that amino acid, attaches it to the growing strand of amino acids, moves forward, reads again, finds the other appropriate amino acid, adds it, and continues moving, and what comes out the other side of the ribosome is a lengthening strand of protein, or U, right? We're all made up of large amounts of protein. So at the level of the ribosome is one of actually many, many mechanisms that translate genotype into phenotype, right? So the genotype in this cartoon is the messenger RNA, and the phenotype is the protein. If you'll remember when we talked about phenotypes is kind of this container word. It means all aspects of the physiology of the organism and its behavior. All physiology and all behavior ultimately is just the way these proteins are printed and how they fold and how all these proteins connect together. So this is a great cartoon because it's a cartoon of this genotype to phenotype mapping as it greatly simplified, as it occurs in biological organisms. And they're going to use this machine as the inspiration for 3D printing these 1D robots. So far, so good?
So the ribosome is going about doing some chemical changes at least, or it's compiling different amounts of proteins. They're all different types of proteins, right? So it's like from a chemical standpoint, there's a lot more variation than just the wire material.
Absolutely. So it's not changing, it's making proteins. So the proteins are made up of amino acids. They're floating around in the soup, the intracellular matrix. And the mRNA is giving instructions about which amino acid should be captured and added to the current end of the protein.
Right. I was wondering if that, in terms of the chemical variety,
Yep.
or the protein variety, is being also explored in evolutionary robotics.
Not so much, not at the atomic level. There aren't any simulations of evolutionary robotics that go down to that level of detail, if that's what you're asking. But
Yeah.
be an interesting thing to try. Okay. One of the interesting things about proteins is, again, ultimately they're just a one-dimensional bead, a string of beads, a string of amino acids, but they curl up into particular three-dimensional shapes. There's a whole other field in biology which tries to predict, given a one-dimensional string of amino acids, what three-dimensional shape will it curl up into. Because the three-dimensional shape of the protein dictates its chemical properties and ultimately its macro scale properties all the way up to us. Okay, so that's the inspiration for this project. We'll play, I think this is about a 2.5-minute video, and it's going to give you an overview of all the parts of this experiment, and then we'll drill down into some of the details after the video. Okay, as we just said, biological systems, are in particular the ribosome, takes information, creates this one-dimensional string, and folds it into a 3D shape. You'll notice in this cartoon here, the red is the actual printer, the part that's going to bend the wire. The gray is the wire itself, and the orange are going to be little motors, which you'll see in a moment, which are embedded into this wire. So they already have motors embedded in the wire along its length. So they have everything they need to make a robot. So here's the printer. It's actually not that sophisticated, quite simple. You can see it turning around its long axis about the wire, which is vertical, and then there's a little head here which is pushing or bending the wire. So they're rotating the machine about the wire and bending it in different directions. You can see the little motors which are embedded in the physical wire. If you remember the simulation a few seconds back, not bad in terms of the reality gap. Take your question after the video. Again, not very sophisticated robots. The idea here was what's a minimal system in which they can completely automate the 3D printing of robots. The recycling, as you can see, is still a manual process. Locomotion over rough terrain, kind of. Questions?
Wow, I was just wondering, so the printer itself has, you can't like swing the robot through the printer. Is that captured in the evolutionary algorithm somehow? Or?
You mean the collision between robots and the machine itself?
And then the printer, yeah.
Or sorry, in the printer.
Yeah.
Yes. So you'll notice, actually, you can see in the screenshot here, the wire is actually almost colliding with the extrusion head on the far side. They're going to consider that when they were actually evolving the robots in simulation to begin with. Other questions? Okay. Okay, so let's have a look at phase one, evolving these things. This should by now look very familiar to you. They were evolving these robots in Open Dynamics Engine, or ODE. ODE is the physics engine that PyroSim is wrapped around. So ODE is written in C. PyroSim is, to all intents and purposes, a Python wrapper for ODE. So exactly the same simulator that you're using. How did they simulate wire in ODE here? You're all physics simulation experts by now. Lots of little cylinders, right? So you got lots of little green cylinders and then larger white cylinders, which represent the motors. They evolved the robots using this thing. What is this thing in panel A? It's a HyperNeat, remember, is the evolutionary algorithm, and HyperNeat evolves populations of these things. What are these things? Lots of acronyms in this class. No. CPPNs, compositional pattern producing networks. They're compositional because they compose functions together, and the functions, which are sitting inside the neurons themselves, our activation functions. Remember, at a neuron, we collect all the incoming signals that are coming in along the incoming synapses. We sum up that raw sum, which becomes the x-axis here, and the value that that neuron then outputs along its outgoing synapses is the y value that's computed from the current x value, or the raw sum. Okay. When I introduced HyperNeat and CPPN a while back, we talked about how a CPPN can paint regular structures within a space of arbitrary dimensions. The first time I showed it to you, we did it in 2D on the board, and we created random CPPNs. And if you remember, those random CPPNs tended to produce non-random patterns. We got things like gradients from left to right, or vertically, or diagonally, or if we include trigonometric functions in our activation functions that oscillate, you can get waves of pattern, or waves of paint, if you like, across your space. So we saw it done for 2 dimensions. A little bit later, we applied CPPNs and we painted patterns in 3-dimensional space. What was that experiment? Why were we painting patterns in 3-dimensional space?
We were developing the morphology of our robot using the turtle.
The turtle, actually, that was the Lindenmayer system, so not the CPPNs.
So that's what it's
Close. Yep.
The soft robots.
The soft robots. So remember the voxel robots that are made up of all those little cubes? We could paint the geometry and material properties inside a 3-dimensional space, which would give us a 3-dimensional robot. Now we're going to paint patterns along 1 dimension, right? Along a single line along the length of the wire. So what are we going to feed as the input? We're going to feed in P, which stands for the current part, or the current part of the wire. And so you can sort of see these parts here. Here's part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5. So they're going to feed in just a single number, which is the sequence, or the number of that part along the length of the wire, just a single number. They also, in my opinion, cheat a little bit by feeding in sine of P. They're trying to influence evolution towards things that repeat over time, like a sinusoidal pattern does, to try and get repeated patterns, which you can see in some of these robots. And they also feed in a third input value, which is the bias, right? A bias will make sure that even if these values are 0, the output of a CPPN doesn't necessarily have to be 0. A bias will help you with that. Yes?
So it looks like some of like it goes different lengths between bands. Are all the lengths exactly the same?
All the
And
lengths are
some
exactly the
turns to
same.
0?
Some of the bends are close to 0, so it looks like it's longer. But all these parts are exactly the same length. Okay. So at the output layer, we have two output neurons. One which is the bend angle, and they're going to scale this output value to 0 or 1. 0 indicates minus 30 degrees, 1 indicates plus 30 degrees. So because they're going to ultimately print this wire, they're going to actually physically bend the wire, the bending is not perfect. So they want to try and make sure that this is a discrete task. So they're going to try and eventually get the 3D printer to bend the wires close to either minus 30 or plus 30, as close as possible. So they could have obviously output just a continuous value, which is how much to bend the wire between minus 30 and plus 30 degrees, but then you're kind of introducing some error. So they're discretizing things a little bit. Just kind of interesting. Mother Nature did the same thing. She came up with a discrete 4-base code for DNA. So in case there's any errors in the ribosome or the other transcription and translation machines in cells, discretization helps to reduce error. We also rediscovered this in the 1950s when we were inventing computers, that it's good to encode everything as a 0 and 1, because if a voltage is a little bit away from 0, you know that it's supposed to be 0. If a voltage is a little bit away from 1, you know that that voltage should be 1. So discretization helps reduce error in systems that make things, like cells, like computers, like our 1D printer that we have here. Okay, the second output neuron here is the bend direction. So the wire is being fed vertically from above and down, as you saw in the video. And instead of the machine twisting the wire itself, the machine actually rotates about the wire, and then the bend arm always bends in the same direction. So if the bend arm is attached to this rotating thing, it can bend plus or minus 30 degrees in different directions, right? Okay, so for each of the pth parts that make up the wire, we're going to bend it either minus 30 or plus 30, and we're going to bend it in this particular direction, right? So we're going to move along the length of this wire, however many parts there are, and for each part, we're going to get these two numbers. So far, so good? Yes?
I may have missed it, but
Yep.
Is the position and number of motors independent of the wire actually being produced, or is it part of the algorithm itself?
It's part of the algorithm. So they're going to assume there's a motor every, whatever this is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parts, right? So we're assuming that we already have this material that's made, which again is kind of cheating a little bit, right? They have this raw material, which is one long wire with motors every kth part. That's built in, doesn't change. Okay. Okay, they mention in the paper that any of the robots are made up of anywhere between 50 and 100 segments. So I don't think the total number of segments was under evolutionary control, but I might have missed that in the details of the paper. But between 50 and 100, which means, for example, let's say we have 50 segments, then there are 49 folds that we're going to make, right, at the 49 intersections. And so you can actually do the combinatorics on this about how many possible 1D robots that can be made. So if n is the number of segments, n minus 1 is the number of folds. For each fold, we are going to bend either minus 30 or plus 30. So it's going to be 2 to the n minus 1. At each of the 49 bends, it's either 0 or 1, minus 30 or 30. As well, at each of those is one of 180 bend directions. So if you calculate this all out, you get 1.81 times 10 to the 125. And as the authors mentioned in the paper, that exceeds the computational capacity of the universe. If you want to know how would you ever calculate the computational capacity of the universe, they cite a paper that actually computes it, so we'll take their word for it. So a lot of robots are possible, even given this very simple setup. So if we have this very large number, we can't print all 10 to the 125. So we're going to search this space as efficiently as we can using, surprise, surprise, an evolutionary algorithm. Okay. There are additional detail from the paper. 2 of the output neurons dictate the morphology, the direction and amount of bend at the corners, and a 3rd and 4th output are about the controller. So I mentioned that they embed these little motors inside the robot, and I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit here. I'll come back. So the motors themselves actually twist the 2 wires that arrive and leave at that motor about the long axis of the motor, this little capsule. So they can twist back and forth as you see in this picture. So we're going to create an open loop controller, which I think we've talked about before. An open loop controller simply means that we don't have any sensors, and we're going to send a fixed signal, a fixed oscillatory signal to the motors. Why is it called open loop? Means because the motors are just going to do their thing, and there's no sensor that is sensing the repercussion of that action. When you have a neural network that has sensors and motors, you have a closed loop controller. The sensors sense what they sense. It propagates through the neural network to the motors. The motors do what they do. The robot interacts with its environment. The sensors sense, act, react, and around you go. You have a closed loop. So we have an open loop controller here, no sensors, just these motors. And for each one of these motors, we're going to set the amplitude, the amount of oscillation of that motor, and the phase offset. So if you have 2 motors that are twisting in phase with one another, twisting in phase with one another, or twisting out of phase with one another. Okay. So as we move along this line, when we encounter a motor, we're going to refer to the CPPN and pull out these two numbers and set the amplitude and phase offset for that motor. We continue moving along the wire, querying our CPPN, which bends the wire as we go. When we get to another motor, we refer to the third and fourth output neuron, get the amplitude and phase offset for that motor, set it, move on, and move on. Make sense? So for one CPPN, it's going to dictate the shape, the morphology of the robot, and its open loop control.
But they pick some constant frequency to send in.
There's a constant frequency, that's right. They could have added that as well. Again, they tried to keep things simple. Same frequency for all the motors. Okay. So we now have our system. We have our population of CPPNs. We're going to use HyperNeat, which evolves these populations of these CPPNs. What's the fitness function? So we'll build up this fitness function incrementally. The first term in this fitness function will look very obvious, very familiar to you by now. We're going to try and maximize the difference between the starting position of the robot and the ending position of the robot. Remember that we're evolving these robots in simulation. So since we're in simulation, we can easily obtain PS and PE. We're not going to have that information when we go to the physical robot. It's still just all in simulation. So we're going to try and maximize distance. We then have 1 minus TQ. The moment you see 1 minus, what does that tell you?
Is it like a probability or something?
Not quite. Alex?
We want it to be as low as possible.
We want it to be as low as possible, right? So TK, which I'll mention in a moment, we're going to try and minimize that term. So we're trying to maximize both of these terms, and we're multiplying them together. So obviously, the closer to 0 this TQ is, the better. TQ is the maximum torque that's applied during the construction of the robot in simulation. If you'll remember, I've mentioned torque a couple times now. Torque is the amount of force that's applied when something is rotating. As you're trying to rotate something, you're applying torque or rotational force to get it there. The maximum torque here that we're interested in is the amount of effort or force that the bending head needs to apply to bend the wire. So depending on the direction of the wire and all the 3D stuff that's hanging off, because remember, as this wire is coming down, we're bending it, and there is a larger and larger shape underneath the print head. It's becoming heavier and heavier, and as it's heavier and heavier, if you're trying to bend the wire, you're bending this whole thing underneath the machine. So bending larger and larger angles later and later in the construction process requires more and more torque. And since we're actually going to transfer this to reality and do this with a physical printer, we want to try and minimize the amount of torque that's applied.
Is there anything that compensates for the amount of bending that might happen to the wire after it is hanging down and has its own weight on itself?
That's a good question. There is nothing that considers that, and evolution probably exploits that. So just because something is bent to a certain angle doesn't mean once it's finished printing or even during printing that those angles are actually going to change. They probably do.
So that torque term seems somewhat counterintuitive to me when you're looking at the CPPN.
Okay.
Because it seems to me like the CPPN is biasing it towards like a regular symmetrical type shape.
Right.
Whereas that torque term would bias it towards a asymmetric shape, potentially.
You mean if you're minimizing the amount of torque?
Yeah, if you have a more complex starting bit and a less complex.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, yes, that's possible. So these things might be in antagonism with one another. That's possible, right? So you're doing some very acute bends early on, and then you're doing less and less bending towards the end of the process. That doesn't fit with this oscillatory regular pattern. That is possible.
How was the torque actually found? Is this like
Good question. How is torque found? It turns out that in ODE, this is a tricky thing to actually compute. So in all the sensors that are available to you in PyroSim, there's one that is conspicuously absent, which is a force sensor. It would be nice to get, if you were to place a force sensor at an angle, to know how much force was applied by the motor to actually perform that rotation. It's a tricky thing to get out of the physics engine, but not impossible. So they're actually reaching down into the physics engine, pretty deep into the physics engine, and pulling that out. And yes, they're estimating it. It's not perfect, and estimating the amount of force that was applied in the physics engine to perform that bend. Okay.
So you're talking, or someone else asked
Yep.
about about bending afterward, like stretching out bends or something like that.
Right.
But it seems like that wouldn't be captured in the physics engine, because the physics engine would just set the angle to 30 degrees, and it's not gonna.
And hold it there.
Yeah.
So they did not in the paper. They might. There's also supplementary material that goes along with the paper, and I didn't get a chance to read the supplementary material. The details might be in there. They did not say what kind of joint they used between the green cylinders and the simulator. They could have used a fixed joint, which would try and hold it constant, or they could have used a small hinge joint with a little bit of springiness attached. So if you think about a physical wire, it's not, no matter how thick that wire is, it's not going to hold that bend perfectly. There's going to be a little bit of springiness in there. It's a little bit of stiffness and damping. If you remember all the way back to our lecture on the bipedal robot, we actually talked about simulating springs, which you can do in the physics engine. So they might have put a little bit of springiness in the joints. I'm not sure. Okay, so this second term is kind of interesting. This isn't something that we've seen in any of the evolutionary experiments so far. This is actually a manufacturability term. It's a term that's put in there to try and help make sure that whatever shape is evolved, it's something that can be physically manufactured in this case. So generally speaking, something that applies less torque is going to be easier to make in reality. If you think about the extreme case where all of the bends are 0, then the printer just basically allows the vertical wire to drop down through the machine in simulation and reality. And that design is going to transfer perfectly to reality, right? Requires 0 torque. You're not bending the wire at all, and it transfers perfectly to reality. The unbent wire is going to get PS minus PE of 0 in simulation and in reality. So we're selecting for the behavior we want, displacement, and also saying make sure this is something that we can manufacture. Okay. So the third term that they put in there, which is compactness. So they did not want basically a perfectly straight wire. They wanted interesting 3D shapes. So one easy way to sort of bias evolution towards interesting 3D shapes is to introduce this term compactness. Well, what is compactness? You compute compactness after the robot is printed in simulation. We take the 3D position of each part of the robot, take the average of all of those positions, which gives us the center of mass, or the center of position, perhaps, of this robot. Where's the center of this robot in 3D space? Then we go back and we take the position of each of the parts, and we sum up the distance between that part and the center of mass. That's what the D represents here. And we're going to try and minimize this overall distance. So maximal compactness would be 1 minus 0. And 1 minus 0 would mean that all of the parts are on top of one another and they're all on top of the center of mass, right? Maximally compact. So they're going to multiply by this third term, which is going to try and make interesting 3D shapes while being sure that they're more or less manufacturable and that this thing can locomote. So far, so good? Okay, let's push on. They divide this whole thing by 1 minus CL, which is the number of collisions. And again, they're going, because it's on the denominator here, they want to try and minimize the number of collisions. The more collisions, the greater the denominator, and the smaller F1 is. So how do they know what collisions are? Let's see, I'm going to fast forward again here a little bit. If you look in panel A here, they actually put a simulation of the print head in the physics engine. So as this wire is being extruded in the physics engine, if any of the white or green cylinders come in contact with the gray boxes, that's a collision, right? We're going to try and minimize those numbers of collisions. Okay. All right, so F1 taken together is selecting for 4 different things. Maximize locomotion, maximize manufacturability, create interesting 3D shapes, and minimize the number of collisions during printing. Question?
Maybe I didn't quite understand, but like, what about collisions between the object that's already been printed? If you try and like print a circle, and like you bend it into the end of something, like it's never gonna bend.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Now that I think about it, they probably included self-collisions in there. I would imagine they would.
Wouldn't
Yes.
it have to run to the machine in order to do that?
Sorry?
Wouldn't it have to?
Well,
be
yeah,
machine
maybe a
like
circle is
a-
a bad example, but like, there might be some way that you can bend the right angle at.
You're right. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know whether you could get a circle in the
It would have to
simulation
be
without.
itself in the machine.
Maybe it gets incorporated into collisions with the machine. I'm not sure if you could get a self-collision without a collision with the machine. That's an interesting point.
Probably with the length of each cylinder, and since the angle is so small that you're pushing it, you're not gonna get a self-collision because you can't bend it far enough. Like, it seems like.
But with enough bends, you might have something that comes back around to itself.
Yeah, but like, can't you only bend each like of these segments like up to 30 degrees, right?
Yes?
So then like the maximum would be 30 degrees all around. But
Right.
if the length of the wire is long enough, then like it's probably not going to collide with itself, and therefore not going to collide like with the printer, and therefore not collide with itself.
Well, remember that there's also the bend direction. So if the bend direction is 0, that means that every bend keeps the 1D robot in the same 2D plane, and it'll eventually come back and collide.
But I think it seems like it would collide at the print head.
I think you're right. I think
That's
so.
sort of at the tangent, because that's the tangent.
Yeah.
That's where, yeah.
That makes sense. Okay. All right. So the F1 is a hint that there is probably another term, F2. So we're going to do multi-objective optimization, right? We're going to have these 2 objectives, F1, which we just talked about, and F2, which is phenotypic novelty. We've mentioned a few times in this course by now that when we have a population of individuals, one of the biggest dangers in an evolutionary algorithm is we're going to lose diversity. Very quickly, all the individuals in the population tend to be the descendants of just one ancestor, and they all look very similar, possibly identically. There are lots of different ways to maintain diversity in the population. Last week, we talked about one of those ways of maintaining diversity, which is the age fitness Pareto optimization method, or AFPO. That's the method we tend to use in the lab. There are different ways to do this. Here's one of them. We're going to select on the second dimension for diversity, or novelty, and it's P that's going to remind us that this is phenotypic novelty. So not novelty in terms of the genetic instructions, but in terms of the phenotype, what it looks like. We want to have robots that have very different 3D geometries once they're folded. How do we calculate novelty? This uses a different evolutionary algorithm called Novelty Search, which we haven't talked about in this class yet, but this is also very popular in the field. The way this works is we're going to, in addition to our population of 100 genomes here, or our 100 CPPNs, we're also going to maintain an archive of individuals, and we'll talk about how we make the archive in a moment. Let's just assume we have an archive here. And this archive of these robots exists in very high dimensional space. Each dimension of this space corresponds to the genotype, corresponds to the phenotype, which is the actual bending angles and directions. So I can only draw in 3 dimensions here, so I only included the angle of the first part and the direction of the bend of the first part. The 3rd dimension is the angle of the second part. The 4th dimension is the bend of the second part. 5th and 6th dimension is the angle and bend of the 3rd part. 7th and 8th dimension is the bend and angle of the fourth part, and so on. So if we have a robot that's made up of 50 segments, how many dimensions do we have? We've got 100-dimensional space, right? And within that 100-dimensional space, we have a cloud of points, and each point is going to have a value for each of those 100 parameters, which exactly specifies the 3D shape of that robot, of that point, right? If you think about it, points that are very close to one another in the space have very, very similar angles and directions of bends, which means they have very similar shape. So the further apart 2 points are in this high-dimensional space, the more different their 3D geometry is. So far, so good? Okay. So let's say we're working our way through HyperNeat, and we want to evaluate the second CPPN in the population here in red. We take that CPPN in simulation. CPPN dictates how to bend the wire, and we get our 3-dimensional robot. We simulate the robot in the physics engine, which gives us our calculation for F1. So we know the value of F1 for the robot. And now we want to calculate P, its phenotypic novelty. Is it similar or different to things we've seen before? So we're going to compare it to things we've seen before, which we've stored in this archive. We take our second robot now, not G, not its CPPN, but P, its phenotype, which is its 100 parameters of bend direction and bend angle. We take that and we find the nearest neighbors in this space. So nearest neighbors is a very, very simple machine learning algorithm, which we're combining with an evolutionary algorithm here. We take the phenotype of the second robot here. We calculate its distance to its k nearest neighbors. In this cartoon, it's 3 nearest neighbors. And store that as P of x here. So here's k nearest neighbors. We're going to take the distance between x, which is the current robot, and all the other robots in the archive, or all the other k as neighbors. And obviously, the smaller that P of x is, the less novelty there is, right? We want a robot to be as far from any of these points in the archive as possible. Okay, how do we build the archive? In the first generation, we take the first CPPN, build that robot, put that robot in the archive, and give it maximum novelty. We then go to the second CPPN in the population, calculate its different distance from the only individual in the archive so far. That's the novelty for the second robot. Put the second robot in the archive, and we keep putting robots in the archive until we reach a maximum size. And I forget what it is, it mentions it in the paper. It's usually a dozen, 20, 30 individuals in the archive. And now our archive is full. So we keep going and we calculate novelty as I mentioned before. And if at any point we find a robot which has greater novelty than any robot that's already in the archive, and as you can see, we can calculate the novelty for any robot in the archive by comparing it to all the other robots in the archive. If we find a new robot that has higher novelty than the robot in the archive, we delete that robot from the archive and add the new robot to the archive. So the archive, you can think of this as sort of a minimal spanning set. It's giving us the minimal set of the most diverse kind of robots we've found during evolution so far. And we're going to use that minimal spanning set to estimate the novelty of these new robots in the next generation.
If you printed a robot and then plotted it in this space,
Yes.
and then ended up printing the same robot but in the opposite order, would that,
What do you mean by printing it in the opposite order?
so like you have a pattern that is generated,
Ah.
from printing, making a series of bends and stuff.
Yes.
If it's upside down.
If it's upside down,
Exactly, it
yep.
comes out, it does the same thing. Do you think those two would end up being on the same point or totally different?
What do you think?
I think it would be different.
Exactly. So this naive way of defining the archive doesn't capture, is not perfect, right? It's an estimate of novelty. So what you just said, something that has the opposite order would get an artificially inflated novelty measure. Absolutely.
just for clarification, are they comparing, so when you're comparing the novelty of G2 to G1?
You're comparing the novelty of G2 not to G1. You're comparing the novelty of G2 to all of the points, all of the robots that exist in the archive. These are older robots that appeared in previous generations.
So are you comparing, like, do they compare, like, is it kind of like a sum total, or is it by individual angle? Like, is bend angle 1 in G2 being compared to bend angle 1 in all the other robots specifically? Or
Yes,
is it just the
exactly.
space in general?
No, remember, you're comparing, if we're taking the distance between this point and this point, that distance is a function of how different the bend angle of the first bend, the first junction is in this robot, and the bend angle of the first junction in this robot is. So you're comparing it 1 to 1, right? Okay. I misspoke, however. We are going to compare the novelties of G2 to G1 because all of the G's in the population are going to compete in terms of F2. Right? So you remember in multi-objective optimization, we have our two objectives, F1 and F2. So after we've evaluated all 100 genomes in the population, we now have 100 points, and these are now not points in the archive. These are points in our objective space. Right? We're trying to maximize F1 and we're trying to maximize F2. So which direction are we trying to, or which direction is evolution trying to push in our objective space, in this two-dimensional space? Which positions are more desirable? Top right, exactly, right? So we're looking for points that have high F1 and have relatively high F2, right? So as we run this evolutionary algorithm, points that have low F1 and F2 are going to be outcompeted by points that have high F1 and F2, and this Pareto front over evolutionary time is going to push up and to the right.
Is there a way you could make it less naive for finding phenotypic novelty? Because if you're plotting these points in a k-dimension, you're creating a surface, right?
Not a surface. We have a cloud of points in a 100-dimensional space, and we are then placing a new point in that space and finding the k nearest neighbors.
Okay.
Right? Here we have a surface, which is the Pareto front, right? But these are two very different things. Okay, so we now have our simulator, we have our evolutionary algorithm, we know how to evolve solutions. We're going to evolve using multi-objective optimization, and at the end of an evolutionary run, we are going to take one or a few of the individuals on this front and actually print them physically. So as I mentioned, when we print this physically, we have these motors that can rotate the wires relative to one another. Each one of these little capsules has not just a motor inside, it also has a battery and a wireless microcontroller. So you've got sort of a whole little computer inside each of these capsules. One of these capsules is charged with being the leader, and all the other n-1 or k-1 motors are the followers. The leader is going to send out a wireless clock signal, and all the others are going to listen to the clock signal, and they're going to set their amplitude and phase offset to that clock signal. So all of these motors are not independent. They're communicating with each other wirelessly. The reason we're doing that is we want to make sure that the timing of the rotation of these motors is kept synchronized, because each one has an amplitude and an offset. If they didn't speak to one another, there'd be a little bit of drift, temporal drift over time. And even if they started with the right phase offset, over time, they might start to go in and out of sync with one another, which they're not allowed to do. They have to maintain phase offsets relative to one another throughout the evaluation of one of these robots. So one of the reasons why it's been so hard to 3D print robots for so long is because we sort of need all of this circuitry and all of this wireless communication all on board the robot. Okay. Obviously, these little capsules themselves are not 3D printed. They were manufactured elsewhere, but that might be the next step in this process. Okay. Might be a little bit difficult to see on this slide here. You kind of see this from the video. So the wire is fed from above and drops down through the printer. There's this print head here that rotates about the wire that's being extruded downward. And as this print head turns, there's a little bending pin, and all that bending pin does is bend, right? Bend to plus 30 degrees, or if it's supposed to bend to minus 30 degrees, the print head turns by 180 degrees, and it bends by minus 30 degrees. Make sense? Relatively simple. Okay. Here you can see the wire being extruded, and it almost collides in this case here, but doesn't because it was evolved not to in simulation. You can see it takes quite a while to print. So this is not only simple but slow, but again is meant to be a demonstration of first principles, that this can actually be done. Okay, you saw in the video evolved robots in simulation and then transferred to reality. Just visual inspection will tell you that at least the body plan of the simulated and physical robot transferred pretty well from simulation to reality. If you go back and watch the video on your own time, you'll see that also the behavior matches pretty well. They mentioned in the paper that before they did any of these experiments, they tried out some random robots and watched the behavior of these robots and estimated some of the friction properties, motor strengths, motor speeds, and put that back into the physics engine. So they tuned up the physics engine a little bit to match reality and then let the process go. And they were able, with the same wire, to evolve something that locomotes over flat ground, then locomotes over rough terrain. Then with the same material, they go back and reprint another robot using the same material, which now is able to brachiate a little bit along this beam. Okay. That's the 3D printing of 1D robots. Any other questions about this experiment? Okay, we have one last slide for this class, which has absolutely nothing to do with evolutionary robotics. I end all my semesters with this slide. This is from an economics textbook, and this slide is a little bit dated at this point because you see the last data point on the horizontal axis here ended in 2008. And some very interesting economic things happened after 2008. I'm still waiting for the authors to update this picture. It'd be interesting to see. What they plotted here was earning power, which is on the vertical axis here, and I won't get into the details of it. But basically, the higher you are on the vertical axis, the more you earn or the more things you're able to purchase. You can see that since the 70s, things have changed quite a bit. Before 1973, as long as you had some schooling, and you didn't even have to make it all the way through high school, your earnings went up from the early 60s to the early 70s. After that point, things have changed. Things have got increasingly worse economically for high school dropouts. Things have stayed more or less the same for people that graduated from high school, have some college. College graduates today, or at least in 2008, earn about the same as their parents 30 or 40 years back. The only people that are doing better economically relative to the other groups are those that achieve a master's or a PhD. So this is my final message for this class, which is stay in school. Okay, that's it. Okay, we've got 12 minutes left to have a little bit of a discussion. As I mentioned, we've covered a lot of ground in this course. I hope I've given you a taste for sort of what evolutionary robotics can do and what it hasn't done yet. What are some of the building blocks of intelligence that haven't been covered in this class? Covered a lot of them. Have we covered everything?
Well, I mean, we're doing robotics, so a lot of the things focused on like movement, physical things, but like brain cognition stuff and like recognizing patterns. Like the quick trace robotics kind of touched on language, but like consciousness and sentience and like artificial intelligence, that seems like stuff more for like traditional neural networks and deep learning and stuff that we didn't really do much with.
That's right. So you probably have noticed by the end of this course now there's a deep divide between machine learning and AI. The non-embodied approach to building intelligent machines is very different from the kinds of building blocks that robotics tackles. Pretty much everything we've seen in this class starts with movement, right? You remember that we talked about this question about why plants don't have brains, right? They don't have to move. It seems that brains evolved initially for movement, and then all the other higher level features of intelligence, consciousness, planning, feature detection, pattern recognition seem to be added on top. So the idea in evolutionary robotics is to kind of start with the nuts and bolts of movement, and then if we evolve things far enough, we might be able to add those higher order features on top. But that still remains an open question.
I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on the reformulation that Anton was talking about today, just like explaining it a little.
Yeah, so Anton was here on Tuesday. He was talking about this idea of reformulation. So I'll just try and summarize that very briefly. For a given morphology, it reformulates the problem that that robot faces. So if we have a fitness function for a robot and it has morphology A, then there are certain controllers that will work well for that morphology and other controllers that won't. So it's reformulating the problem actually for evolution, which is evolution has to find a controller for that body. Okay? But the moment that that body changes, there are different controllers that are now going to have to work for that body.
Can you do the same thing with neural morphological change?
It turns out, and we don't have time to get in this today, that it's not always the same the other way around. So for a given neural network, it's much easier to find a morphology that works well for it. Or if there's two different neural networks, sometimes it's easier. You can't invert the problem as well. We have no idea why that's the case, but we've tried that experimentally, and it turns out it's usually the other way around.
You can like add nodes or retract nodes.
You could do that. The question is, does it make things easier or harder for evolution to produce a robot that maximizes your fitness function? Okay. What else have we not talked about in this course?
Emotion.
Emotion, right? So we've definitely left that one aside. If you take my human-computer interaction course in the fall, we talk about human-robot interaction, or HRI, which is similar to, but a little different from evolutionary robotics, which is getting people to interact with robots. People probably don't want to interact with emotionless, faceless robots. It would be nice to have machines that emote. We can make machines that signal emotions, but creating machines that have emotions, that seems to me to be a very different thing, and I have no idea how we would go about doing that. We could measure whether a robot signals emotions, whether it can trick a human into thinking it has emotions, like the Turing test, but measuring whether it actually has emotions kind of takes us back to the Chinese room problem. We're not really clear about what that actually means to have them, so how would we know whether a machine has them or not?
Sort of pain, discomfort, you know.
What is it?
Yeah.
I don't know.
There's a neurologist, I'm forgetting his name, slipping my mind, who's done recent research into saying that like emotions are initially developed through the same idea as like an embodied reactions. Like when you have anxiety, your heart goes faster and you get a little nauseous and these kind of things. So then even if you instill those physical attributes in a person, regardless of how they're feeling, you cause a feeling, right? If you smile when you're unhappy, over time, over a little bit of time, you get happy.
Okay.
And so if you made a robot that was a human, that was like humanoid, and you gave it these physical actions and told it, just like in Twitch, but robotics, what that represents, couldn't you then have a robot with some form of like a basic emotion?
So those are the physical correlates of emotion, right? Elevated heart rate, sweating, right? Those are the physical correlates of the thing that's causing it, which is an emotion.
Yeah.
We can, of course, put the physical correlates into a robot, right? But whether those physical correlates then correlate with emotions inside the machine, the thing itself, not the thing that's causing the physiological response, I don't know what that thing is. Some of my colleagues disagree and think that we can instill emotions in machines. I'm not convinced yet. Okay, yes?
So just in the,
That's right.
in that realm of emotion, I know in some forms of Eastern medicine at least, emotion is like simplified down to just the bare minimum of like sensor values, basically. Like what you're feeling, whether you're feeling like physical pain, whether you're feeling uncomfortable, and a lot of times the physiological, like the heart rate and internal things are like easier to keep track of or easier to place as emotion. But like if it's down to just sensor values like that, then it's pretty much already there.
True. So you can obviously make a robot that senses light levels, right? What would be a sensor that senses pain? You could make a sensor for a robot that senses mechanical damage, right? Is that the same thing as sensing pain? Pain is not necessarily the same thing as just mechanical damage. So again, it becomes, there's this gap that arises between the physiological component, damage or something else, and the emotion associated with it, which is pain, right, or a painful experience. To me, there is a big gap between those two things, and we don't necessarily know how to cross it.
Well, is pain actually, is pain an emotion?
Again, I don't know. I don't know.
Trauma is, not function pain. How can you give the robot trauma?
All right, let's move on to my second question. How has your thinking about robotics and AI changed from the beginning of the semester to now?
Before, I guess, I placed it much more general, much more trying to replicate consciousness, I guess.
Okay.
Much more trying to have a bot that's smart and knows what it's doing.
Okay.
And now it seems much more task-oriented.
Much more task, and that's just the direction that the field has gone in, because again, it's hard to know what is consciousness, how would you put that into a machine. Much easier to get it to do something, and then maybe consciousness will evolve, or our emotion will evolve in response to whatever we actually want it to do, possibly. Other thoughts?
I guess just like I've known what evolutionary robotics was because I've seen you talk before, and it's like, well, you just like tell a robot to do it, and evolution will magically do it. But like, as we found out, like it's really hard to get it to do what you want, and not do what it's not supposed to. And like, we've been focusing on very specific things, where like, how are we possibly going to scale it up to a general purpose computer robot that can like replicate all the situations that we can do? It's just open eyes to how much we still have to do.
Exactly. So one of the things I hope you take away from this is when you're talking to your friends and you tell them about this class, they say, oh, cool, robots. When are we going to have human-level intelligence in our robots? Your answer is going to be, hopefully, not anytime soon, right? We've still got a lot of work to do in the field, and as I mentioned, I think there's a lot of open problems, and it's an exciting time to be involved in robotics and AI, and I hope some of you take me up on that challenge. Thank you very much for a great semester. This has been a lot of fun, and we will see you on the 10th. There'll be one last quiz due tonight. Last quiz.
Fun class.
Great, all right. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Oh, awesome. Okay, all right. So first thing is just send me an email to remind me about that, and I'll point you to the web page that I had up, and that'll take you onward to the UVM Jobs website where you can officially apply. All right, good. Thanks for your interest.
If people have
Questions?
Oh, I just want to thank you so much for this course. It's been fantastic. It's been so mind-blowing from day one to the end.
Great.
My God. It's so well taught, just from every single lecture, so well choreographed, so well put together. And the way that you record all of your lectures and have them online for people that either, I mean, obviously it's very early in the morning, it's hard to respond and think critically at 8:30, so being able to go back and go through those lectures again and solidify that information is key. It's amazing. I just want to congratulate you on all you've done, of course, and how much you changed my understanding of evolutionary robotics and sparked a real creative and energy, as well as a fascination in the subject matter.
Glad to hear it. Hope to see it in your final project.
I will, hopefully. I think so.
Yes. The plot is kind of optional. So the one thing you need to do is convince us that evolution has moved beyond random controllers, right? So the simplest way to do that is to show the two videos, one with the random controller and the other one with an evolved controller. And if myself and the TA can see that the evolved behavior is very improbable. So it would be very unlikely if I ran a million random controllers, I'm unlikely to get what you showed us. Then you prove to us that you did some evolution. If you want to include this fitness curve plot as well, that's optional. It's up to you, right? As long as you have time to cover the other three points.
What are you working on? I've got 3 robots, all wheels. Cool. Winged or wheels?
So there's the written report and the overall thread. So in the video, if you just go back, it says you need to convince us of the 4 points.
So they're all.
I can't remember what the 4 of them are off the top of my mind. It's up to you how you convince us of that.
I'm hoping that I can
So
actually.
the 2 videos, as I mentioned, that's me telling you here's one good way to do it. There's different ways to
But
That is tough.
For the other 3 points, bullet points, like some short text, or it can be a picture, whatever you want. It's up to you.
That, they may
Okay.
line up
Yep.
differently.
Hi there.
Or like, one
Sure.
going slowly and faster, one that's
Okay.
closer and slower.
Yep.
So the hard thing is they all have to use the same focus. So it gets a little funky. There's one.
So I'm trying
So
to
they
raise
see
the
like,
Okay.
and then they
I originally wanted them
like
like
this
this
one
couple log
and
inputs.
they like
Yeah, that's too much. Picking up the log is already.
yeah. For this one is somewhat like 0.3.
Well, that's the thing.
Like, and this one
Just, I'm just doing something real simple. I'm just doing, I'm
This one, I
just
know
changing the
what's
environment to put the, with phototext on slope, and then just mess with the environment variables just to see what sort of behaviors I can.
If you use a position sensor
in one
rather
from
than a
the,
light
from
and
the robot, so
Then-
basically,
But
I'll
then
have
the
the,
evolution
I
is
have
what's
3
the
different,
fitness.
yeah, I have 3 different environments. One
I
where
don't know,
there's,
yeah, you're
there's the
gonna
slope,
have to try and
it
see if
will
you can get in
change,
touch with the TA.
orientation, but always
It's
have
hard for me to
the, light
diagnose
source
what the
at top
problem is.
slope. So the
just
robot
from
will
the
always have an
description.
upward climb, but won't
All right.
necessarily always be
Okay,
moving
good
in the
luck.
same direction.
Hey
And
there.
then another environment.
Oh,
where,
yeah,
the
awesome.
slope
Good,
changes
glad you
on
enjoyed
the
it.
actual
Yeah, it was
cardinal direction of
awesome
light
class.
source.
Great,
Definitely
glad to hear it.
recommending it to other people.
Please do, please do. Thank you.
I want to figure out how
But,
to
yeah, I
move
think
up,
it's-
left, right, down on slope.
It's a unique structure
And
for
the
the
last
class,
one
I
has
think,
just
just
controls,
how,
the rate of phototext.
sort of short
And then just taking the
quizzes
results and comparing
after
to
every
see what we
class,
can, what sort of information we can draw out.
and really no
Nothing
exam
yet
type
because
thing.
I'm not.
It's the
not
type of thing
super
where all
well
students are always
and
like, oh yeah, I don't
actually
want any exams.
because I'm working on
Usually it's
many
like,
other things.
everyone thinks, oh, that's just makes the class easier or something.
Like if you had time,
You-
maybe you
We'll
Figure-
see with the
you-
final project.
Yeah, I think
Not
it was,
necessarily in
was
using
max
the final
The
exam.
max
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that
I
was
think
the algorithm with
Yeah.
this class is structured so it actually works out quite well, where you still,
Yes.
and then like
you
that
learn
would
so
be- that would be a great mathematical problem.
Yeah,
Right?
so
So
would.
what's next for you after this?
Because then you could rely
So
on
I'll be
changing
heading
different
to
controllers
UCLA
depending
for
on how.
graduate
Oh, great,
Um,
okay,
But you also need
I'm
like,
looking to do some
Exactly.
research
But that, I mean,
in
you could say that,
combining
yeah, given the time, this
learning
could be used in this,
and
for this,
with
these
animal
applications.
engineering. And sort of,
Yeah, exactly,
there's
exactly.
one faculty member in particular
Thank
that's
you, that's a
working on
good
that sort
idea.
of combined
Well, I'll see you guys
method
later.
to
see you later.
just solve engineering problems.
Who's that?
He's a relatively new
Oh,
person.
UC
Yeah,
Davis.
UC
Oh, okay,
Davis,
okay,
yeah.
okay. Great.
So,
Cool, well, good luck.
Yeah,
All
thank
right,
you.
all right.
Um,
Yes, sir.
Just a few more things about the
Sure.
job.
A little bit of everything.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
yep.
So like, are you imagining this like new thing to be that people can say, I want my code to run traditionally or on this other
Yes,
thing?
so when you compile your code, you, like I showed you in class today, you might look at the VACC, and if there's 1,000 nodes that are available at that point in time, then you would push your code to the VACC. But if this VACC is maxed out, then you could try and push your code to the browser component. It's up to you as the faculty member or the grad student. You'd have these two options available. So not everything can be pushed to the browser because when you transpile code, certain libraries don't transpile. So it depends on, basically what we're envisioning is there'd be kind of a checklist. So when you try and transpile your code, it'll do a pre-check to see if there are illegal libraries, and it says, sorry, you have to go the traditional route. But more and more of the jobs that are going to the VACC are sort of very simple routine jobs. So there's a lot of faculty members that are doing things with tweets, and those are just like pulling words out of the tweets. They're very, very simple, right? Very, very simple computational jobs that could easily be done on other machines. So if we could move some of the Twitter stuff to another source, that would be great. That's also an option. I've tried that, doesn't work. Just kidding. Yes, other questions?
So like who's using it? Speaking with like research people here, is that it?
Yeah, so what we proposed to Sloan, so this is going to be a 3-year project, is years 1 and 2 we develop what we're going to call UVM computes. So it'll be for all of UVM, but obviously anyone who opens their browser to Sage would help with the job. You don't have to be at UVM, but it's more like a school spirit type thing. It's trying to get as many people on campus involved. And then push this out to GitHub, and the code would be UXX compute. So another university could download the code and dedicate a server on campus to that, and then they could have the same thing at their institution.
And how do you imagine like getting people on board to like actually run the thing? Because like I don't know, this seems like
Why would you do it?
intentionally like there's sites that like secretly mine Bitcoin
Right.
when you just go to their site and
Right.
they don't tell you.
Right.
But like,
So this is a Red Sox show, right?
yeah.
So did the Red Sox ask you to wear this sweater? You did it because you like the Boston Red Sox, right? So if you like UVM, it's the same sort of thing. It's like help your school, right? So we'd have like a simple GIF that would just say, open a browser, make it small, put it in the right-hand side of your screen so that the browser is always open to that page, and then just do your normal stuff. So there's also an advertising campaign that's going to go along with this about how would you incentivize UVMers to do this. One aspect is to try and connect with the Alumni Association. So there's many more alumni than there are current students on campus. So if you're an UVM alum and you want to help your school, it's an easy way to do it. Whether we can get enough people to do it, we will see. That's part of that's sort of the crowdsourcing part of it. You're welcome. Alex.
Yeah, I had a question about fitness functions generally.
Sure.